So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Donnell. I live in Caid in Santa Barbara. I am champion to Her Majesty Tahira Al-Fahida. And this is my class that I put together as an approach to the rapier metagame, or how to adapt to the opponent, or how to train yourself to be able to adapt to an opponent. And so this is sort of, to some extent, the way I think about outthinking the opponent in the fight. I don't use it all the time, but it directs a lot of my training and the way I sort of think about the metagame of how I approach rapier. So I want to talk about a sword and toolbox system. The basic idea of a toolbox system is to develop multiple techniques that can kill the opponent, study their fight, ideally before the fight, but also in the fight, and then use the right tool to maximize the chance of winning the fight. To some extent, this is a bag of tricks. And to some extent, this is, hey, even if you're not using a bag of tricks, you still need to figure out how you want to engage your opponent and what you want to try. So the more you have a foundational system, the safer it will keep you in between the attacks you want to make. Whereas if you just sort of go out there and stand there and go, I'm going to try trick number 1, trick number 2, and trick number 3, that's not terrible, but it's maybe not the best way to approach the system. Now, the basic conceit of a toolbox system is that most opponents have a weakness that can be exploited with the right choice of well-drilled technique. This is not always true, but when you go to engage someone, you do have to have a plan. But in my experience, there are very few fighters out there that don't have some weaknesses that can't be exploited. And even if they don't have weaknesses, they have things that make one choice better than another, based on the relative disparity of size or strength or speed that you can use to decide how you want to engage your opponent. So I'm going to use a few different words. A tool, for purposes of this, I'm going to make up some vocabulary to make this work a little better. A tool is a basic system and guard that provides for offense and defense. Or sorry, that's a tool set. A tool set is a basic system and guard that provides for offense and defense. So for instance, if you're doing 6-gun sword and dagger, now I'm going to fight with my sword down here and my dagger up here. I am in a particular guard. The tool set is the way I think about a guard. But the tool set idea is that from here, I could counterattack with parry and sword. I could counterattack with sword alone. I could bait you to go this way, and I could compass. And all of those things are different tools out of one tool set. And the tool set is partly the way you think about using the system. That's the reason it's not just a guard. A guard might be, hey, I'm going to stand in this position. This is, this is guard number 73 of Fabris. But the tool set is what's preloaded in your mind that you're going to use while you're in that position. And there might be multiple tool sets that can fit within a guard. And the more you're able to hold in your brain without slowing down, the better, right? So you can have a very complicated tool set, like a sword and dagger approach that involves multiple passes, and sometimes using the sword, sometimes the dagger. You could have a very simple system like the Black Tiger cross parry system, where you're just going to stand there with your dagger over here, and everything they throw, you're going to block that way, right? And that's an example of a more simple system. One of the reasons in thinking about this is that your ability to beat your opponent with any technique is going to depend on how well you can execute it and how quickly you can do it without thinking. One of the things that makes the Black Tiger cross parry system so effective is that they use one parry for everything. So if you use one parry for everything, you don't need to make a decision. You just need to decide when and where to go. And so every single shot, every single thing they do consists of take the dagger, move it across your body to intersect with the attack, and then stab the opponent in the armpit. If you're doing a more complex system, you need to have comfort and understanding with that in order for that to work. Finally, a couple more terms. A tool is a specific active or reactive tactic you're going to launch from that guard or in that tool set. So a tool could be, I'm going to attack your wrist, and if you withdraw the hand, I'm going to continue to the body and strike. A second example, and then in addition to tools, we can have counter tools. Counter tools are two tools that set up each other's attacks. So for instance, in the case where, let me give you an example here. Here's a single sword case. I'm standing on guard. Imagine you decide to attack my wrist, right? Here I am standing on guard, trying to constrain you, maybe not doing the world's best job of it. If you attack my wrist and I withdraw the hand, you'll be able to continue an attack into my flank. And that can be very effective against somebody who pulls their hand back when they're attacked. On the other hand, if instead of pulling my hand back, you attack my wrist and I overreact bringing my point to the outside, right? You can then disengage your attack around the outside and hit me in the flank instead of basically coming over the sword, you come under the sword. And those are two different tools, and they're counter tools of each other. One is the attack through the withdrawn sword into the flank, and the other is when I overreact, bring the sword underneath and strike me maybe a little bit higher. And those are two tools that can set each other up. I show you one, and then depending on how you react, I can set up another. You can also have tools where them overreacting to the first action sets up the second action. So now I want to talk about two different basic kinds of tools we can have. The first kind of tool is an active tool. An active tool, like for instance trying to poke the guy's hand, is a tool where you initiate the attack. And it's generally speaking going to work better for somebody who has reach, has speed, has some kind of advantage that's going to let them make an attack safely without getting skewered in the process. So generally speaking, your tool should be a simple technique for paired offense and defense, and it should be suitable for practicing in a simple drill. So if I want to learn a tool, my goal is to get it to the point where I don't need to think about it to do it, and I can do it with basically no delay and execute it perfectly 98% of the time, right? So to do that, you want it to be suitable to a simple drill, partly so you can practice it. So a lot of the idea of having drills, having tools, is being able to build and hone those tools. So this section is going to be on building tools. A reactive tool lets the opponent act or attack first, and then you execute the appropriate counter. That's going to be more appropriate for shorter fighters, but it can also be really appropriate against an opponent who wants to bring the fight to you. If they're not going to let you stand around and dance and set up whatever probing and whatever attacks you want to make, then you may be put into a position where you need to use reactive tools, all right? And the way I've generally approached these tools, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is anything that I've taken as a drill, like take a class, someone teaches a drill, I go, oh, that's neat. Usually the drill contains, hey, do this thing. And then when they try to stop you from doing that thing, do this other thing. Well, you've just got a tool and a counter tool. Now, if you take that and you say, well, I'm going to vaguely integrate that into my fighting style, and I'm going to just try to keep that in mind and maybe use those ideas in the middle of the fight, you're going to have to be a very advanced fighter to do that without a significant, cognitive delay to implement those things. If you instead go off and say, that's a cool drill, I want to learn, I want to learn how to do that. And you simply practice that A and that B. Then you just have to figure out where that A and that B fit into the fight. You need to figure out what makes that a good choice. So it's very important that you have a drill that goes with this, because it allows you to build well-developed muscle memory of the tool and also reduce the cognitive delays. Also, obviously, if you sit there thinking in measure, you're probably going to get stabbed. So you need to be able to purge any thinking in measure. Do your thinking out of measure, or ideally before the fight, or in practice. Don't do your fighting in measure, obviously. From my perspective, I'm usually only trying to do one thing at a time. I'd say for people who think in computers, right? I have one tool loaded in my registers, and then I have one idea of what I might try next. Sometimes your opponent gives you an opening, and you go, oh gosh, opening, and you jump, right? And that's fine if it works, and if you've practiced it, you're more likely to hit when you jump. Of course, keep in mind that the entire set of passive tool or reactive tools that I would teach you are exactly that. They're showing the opponent an opening to make them jump without thinking. So be aware that you may be walking into a trap when you leap first without having thought through your actions. So carrying on, covered that. Okay, so where do you find tools? Anything you do in a drill in a class is pretty much built in as a tool, and it usually comes with a counter tool, which is nice, because having a tool and a counter tool generally means that when they do a good job of defending against A, you have a B. If you only have an A, that's fine, but if they cover A, then you're just going to have to move on from that because it's not going to work. Random attacks you learn, say at collegium, like I just showed you, this feint at the hand, and if they withdraw the hand, continue to the body, and if they cover too much if they bring their sword offline to cover, disengage underneath and strike them in the flank. You could take that. You can go practice that. It's a pretty straightforward drill, and that's good. And then you basically say, okay, you fought in a tournament, you lost, someone hit you. You say, how did you hit me? I totally didn't see that coming. And they take you off the side and show you, right? Take the time at that moment to say, okay, how do I do that as a drill? And then go take that home and practice that shot. That's one of the ways you could take this random thing you learned in a tournament fight and turn it into a more useful, generally applicable case that you can then bring forward in your fighting. So the next thing I want to talk about is practice. I call this honing and understanding your tools. As you hone your tools, as you practice them, you're going to get a better sense of under what circumstances they work. You need to make those observations as you drill, and frankly, that makes drilling more fun anyway. If I'm just mindlessly doing the same drill against the same person, right, I'm at least building muscle memory, but I'm maybe not seeing the reasons why I want to use that tool and the reasons I would use the tool against this person, and maybe the when. So when you want to learn a physical skill, right, the first thing you need to do is start practicing the tool in a vacuum. So set up if a drill's suitable to solo work, you can do some solo work first. Then bring in a crash test dummy whose sole job is to be cooperative. And you practice against that sole person until you're practicing, okay, here's my feint, there's my go, feint, disengage, go. And you practice those techniques against that one person. If there's any resistance that they can give, you want them to gradually increase the resistance, whether that's them acting faster, pushing harder, mixing up the between the A and B actions. You want them to gradually increase the difficulty of your drill. Citing here Kaya Sadowski from Fear is the Mind Killer, she did a bunch of research and she found that if you're executing the drill correctly 75% of the time, it's at the right difficulty level. If you're executing the drill correctly 100% of the time, you're using a marionette and you need to increase the difficulty. If you're less than 50% of the time, they're making it a little too hard on you, and your partner needs to make it easier on you. They need to be a little slower. You need to work at a deliberate pace where you can succeed between 50 to 75% of the time. So when you're learning, that's sort of the basic approach. Once you've learned against a single person and you've got the technique right, then you need to generalize the technique. You need to say, okay, this is how it works against Bob, right? Now let's try seeing how it works against Maria. And then you bring Maria in and you try the same technique. Now Maria's a little shorter and her arm's a little longer, and so that changes the dynamics of the drill. Or she's got a 35 and he had a 42. And so as you use that technique against more people, what that's going to do is it's going to allow your brain to generalize how to implement that technique against an arbitrary fighter, because you may not have practiced against the arbitrary fighter trying to use it against in a tournament. So continue drilling until you're getting it. My handout is a little old. It says 80% of the time at 80% speed, and 90% of the time at 90% speed. But you want to be able to execute it smoothly and have it work. And I've got some details in there. I will cede to Kaya's research on that, given that she actually did more paper research and mine is just sort of personal expertise. Once you've done that, if it's not working, look at why. If you're trying this on a particular partner and it's not working, this is the opportunity to slow it down and understand why. Is your technique not adjusting to the new person's geometry? Or is something about their guard or their approach to the fight causing it to fail? Once you can identify what causes it to fail, you can do one of two things. You can either say, hey, this doesn't work against this kind of person and here's why, which is an important part of understanding. Or you can say, oh, when I'm fighting a shorter fighter, I need to bend my knees a little bit to get to the angle I want when I start. So it'll allow you to adjust to the geometry. Once you've practiced against a handful of fighters, and obviously you can do some practice drills and then move into sparring, try it in a limited sparring sense. Ask your opponent not to do anything too weird, right? For instance, if you're beginning and you're just practicing your counterattacks, ask your opponent to look, just attack along these two lines. Don't do a beat, feint, triple disengage, because that isn't going to teach me anything, right? And I'll talk about that later, about how to approach your sparring to get more out of it. It basically boils down to go into each sparring session with an intent. And if you want your partner to teach you something, or your sparring partner to teach you something, tell them and ask for what you want. Almost everyone I've experienced will be happy to do 5 or 10 passes of a drill and then maybe limit their fighting a little bit if they're fighting a newer fighter before they go into open sparring. So be willing to ask for that. When you're then doing your limited sparring and you're setting up essentially the drill, but in the context of a fight and with extra footwork and changing position and finding the times, use your new tool frequently, but stay focused on executing the tool, not on winning. If it's going badly, ask your opponent to slow down. It's not a big deal if you're trying to do limited sparring and you're trying to practice a thing to say, hey, could you slow it down to 80%? I'm just not getting what I'm working on. So be willing to spend time on the learning process, not just on going to fight. If it's still going badly, stop, break it down, talk about it, and maybe say, hey, could I do that in a drill 3 or 4 times until I find what I'm looking for? The next component is, in addition to like learning to improve your technique with a tool during practice, is to understand the tool. Tools work best when they surprise the opponent or attack their weak points. If you're using a technique that relies on reach against somebody who has reach, maybe it's going to work if they aren't using their reach, but most reach fighters have a concept of how to use their reach and keep their sword between them and you. So for each tool, try to identify 1 to 2 key indicators. This is going to sound overly, at first that sounds a little like overthinking it. But if I'm going to attack someone, if I'm going to poke at someone's wrist and then try to continue to the body, which is a simple thing, it works better if I have reach or a longer sword. It also works better if I am quicker, or I have a quicker, or a quicker person. There are other techniques that if you're a shorter fighter with a smaller sword, you have a quicker sword and you need to use that. So that's another case. If you think faster than your opponent and you see that your opponent has a little bit of a slowdown delay, right? Things that change the line and move quickly between threats can often work better for you. If the opponent doesn't back up well, right? That's another case where you can start pushing them and push them back. And as a hint, a lot of fighters who like to come forward don't go back well. If it seems your opponent doesn't judge range well, that's another case where you can have tools that are designed for people who don't judge range well. If your opponent likes to initiate attacks, you can then set up reactive systems that take advantage of their tendency there. If they like to throw committed attacks, that's great. Once you see that somebody likes to throw committed attacks, you can now work with that. You now know that the thing coming is not a feint, and you can more commit to your counterattack, being less concerned that there's a feint. If your opponent's a committed counterpuncher, every time you throw a shot, they're going to throw a counter. Well, now you know how to trigger your opponent to do what and where you want to do. So I've got a whole list of these in my handout. I'm not going to read every single one of them, but when you're look through these and go, oh, hey, yeah, that does work better. That thing I do does work better when they recover from lunges slowly. If I give ground and then chase them back, they don't recover well from lunges. That's a great plan. And think about the people in your practice and what might work best on them, because that'll help you see and understand this stuff. Finally, after you've thought this through, test your theory on several fencers with those characteristics. If you're doing this in a sparring context, in an open sparring context, right, what's going to happen is anybody in an open sparring context is going to adapt to what you do, right? So don't look at if you try it 10 times over the course of 3 minutes of sparring or 5 minutes of sparring, of course they're going to adapt to what you do, right? So you can use the tool a lot, but focus most on the results of the first few times you did it right. If the first 3 times you did it right, 2 of them hit, and then after that they adapted and didn't work again, no problem, because in a fight you only need to hit them once or twice, depending on whether it's best 2 out of 3 or 1 shot. So once you've practiced a tool and you've done it 2 or 3 times and your opponent starts to adapt to it, now's your opportunity to try the counter tool for it. So if you know what the counter tool is, if I poke your wrist and follow you back to the body and you suddenly start to feel threatened by that wrist shot, then I'm going to switch what I'm focusing on, not from trying to beat you despite the fact that you're prepared for it, but now I'm going to focus on showing the one thing and switching to disengage underneath, for instance. After you practice the counter tool, you might also find that the original tool opens up again. So there's lots of opportunities to play with this and get practice. When is a tool ready for tournament use? So you've been doing this, I've been talking about practice so far. If you understand how to use it safely, even if it doesn't hit very often, it's fine. One of the basic principles of this kind of fighting is, live to try another attack. If I have an attack that hits 10% of the time and gets me hit 0% of the time, I can use that attack in every fight and not worry about what's going to happen if I try it. So if you can use it safely without getting hit and without hurting your opponent, it's pretty much good. It may not be effective, but it's worth a try. You need to be able to execute the tool confidently, though probably not reliably against all opponents. If you're like, oh, hey, I can totally hit this person with this action, go for it. Right? Don't worry about the fact that you can't execute it against 3/4 of the fighters. You're not fighting 3/4 of the fighters. You're fighting 1 right now. If it supports a sharp counter tool, that can be great. If I've got a dull, not very effective attack, but I show it a couple times, my opponent starts to set me up with it. I show it once, twice. The 3rd time, I go with the counter tool and I hit them on what they've started to open up by preparing to counterattack my first option. There's a rule of 3 in fencing. If you do something 3 times in a row, you're probably going to die the 3rd time you try it. So it's fine to show something once, show something again, though not immediately. But the 3rd time you set it up, you should expect your opponent to be prepared for it, and that's probably where the counter tool comes in. Finally, if you have something that I'm going to call a dull tool, it's not ready for use, right? You can still maybe threaten it and gather a little data while you're in the middle of the fight, but don't go too crazy with that. Obviously, if you are doing experiments that they're not going to help you win the fight in a fight, that's how you get yourself stabbed. So that's sort of how you go about building and practicing your techniques and understanding what they're good for. Understanding what they're good for is really important. If you don't know what your techniques are good for, they're going to be less effective for you, even if you can practice them in a perfect context. You have to go in and say, hey, this looks like a good option here. And that's going to be my next topic, which is choosing from among your tools in a fight. I threw in, if you look at the handout, there's a bunch of annoying Princess Bride quotes in here, right? You use different techniques when you're fighting 6 people, then you only have to be worried about 1. So you need to assess your opponent and determine what's best for this situation. What do you know about the opponent's strengths and weaknesses? You should know about a lot of these before you go into the fight. Take the time to look at the length of the sword. You're going to have trouble not noticing the length of the fighter. What reach, weapon, and offhand mismatches exist? If I've got a buckler and you've got a dagger, I need to keep you from closing to dagger range. That's going to go badly for me, so I need to take that into account. Take into account the terrain. Where's the sun? Where's the wind? Don't bring a cloak in a hurricane. Where is higher ground? Higher ground can come in handy. Lower ground can come in handy if you're a short fighter and you can trap your opponent's sword under your blade. So where are those things? Take time to look at the field. Are there any obstacles on the field? Could you use those? And finally, what is the opponent's mental state? If someone is bouncing around like a jelly bean, right, you should probably expect them to be coming at you aggressively or be trying very intent attacks. If someone is stone cold, chances are they're probably not going to leap at the first invitation you make. Now, lay on is called. All those things you should have thought about before lay on is called. You can obviously think about them after lay on is called, but it would be better if you used the time before lay on to prepare for those things. So before you get to crossing blades, what is the opponent's guard and presentation? Where are the strengths of the guard? Where do you not want to attack? Where are the weaknesses of the guard? Where do you want to attack? And what's the weakness of the stance? How will the offhand weapons be used in this guard? So I'm going to give you some examples of that now. All right, here's the sword and dagger guard. Here's the sword and dagger guard. Well, what is this attack? What is this guard trying to do? You want to think about that. What does this guard cover? What does it expose? Right? It certainly exposes the head, right? It doesn't expose the legs. It brings the body forward where I can throw rapid attacks, so it lets me launch quickly, right? But it commits me, most importantly, it commits me to making aggressive head parries, which means that I can kind of pick on the fact that this needs to be a key point of the defense, right? But at the same time, that's likely to be an immediate offense, and I need to be prepared for it. If I'm in, black tiger guard down here, what is it? What's open? What's closed, right? In this case, the big rose in the middle of my chest is a trap. It looks like an option. It looks like a great idea, but it's actually an opportunity. On the other hand, the sword is way down here out of the frame, right? We can constrain that sword and make this fighter's life miserable because they can't get the sword on the target from way down here if it's heavily constrained, possibly even constrained with an offhand weapon. Okay, so you start your fight, and you want to make an initial assessment. What advantages do I have here? So this goes back to understanding your tools. You want to rapidly look through your list of tools. Hopefully you've thought about this a little bit, after you practice thinking about your tools more and faster, it'll come quicker in a fight. What advantages do I have? What tools give me the best chance to win against this opponent today? You may have tools that you would love to use. You'd love to use like that beat fate triple disengage, or you'd rather use a compass step. That would be lovely. But if that's not what this opponent needs today, leave it on the shelf, stick to what the opponent will need today. Where is my opponent dangerous? Figure out how you're going to get killed before you get killed that way. And finally, this is really important. How can I safely approach my opponent and probe? Can I come forward? Can I get to the edge of my measure? Can I start to poke around at my opponent and see whether or not I can find openings by doing kind of experiments on them in the middle of the fight? Or am I going to get skewered doing that? And if I can't do that, how do I stay safe? Because regardless, I need to stay safe when I do anything in fencing. Otherwise, I'd better just cross fingers and go, right? The basic idea of this system is I need to take the time to understand my opponent. If I don't have the time to understand my opponent because I'm dead, that doesn't help me. So you need to figure out how to stay safe while doing experiments on your opponent and trying different techniques. The thing that works in your favor here is that most opponents don't adapt their fight to the opponent, besides noting who has reach. My experience is that I can count on 90% of my opponents to do the same thing basically every time. Assuming you fight the same people much of the time, that allows you to, like all this stuff I'm talking about, very cerebral, too much analysis in the middle of the fight. But in reality, if I fought that person 15 times and they fight the same way, or they have like two different styles of fighting, you've seen it. You know what to do. You can learn from the fact that you lost last week to them, and you can apply that today to take a different approach today. So anyway, you don't have to be all that clever to gain advantages, but there's no excuse not to think, at least outside of engagement, and definitely not outside of the fight. After you lose a fight, think about why you lost the fight and what you could have done differently. If you don't do that, if you just go out and fight your same fight every time, you're just rolling dice, and the dice aren't even. And even if the dice favor you, why leave it to dice, right? Figure out how to reliably beat your opponent and do it. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is how to probe the opponent. So now you're in a fight, you have some ideas of what you might try, but your opponent isn't going to like have the cheat codes printed on their chest of do this, try method 3 and then kill them with method 3, the counter tool of method 3. So let's talk about what we want to do when we're approaching an opponent and figuring out where they're vulnerable. Maybe it's the same place they were vulnerable last week. Maybe it's not. Maybe you haven't fought this opponent. You're going to have to figure that out. Good news is if you haven't fought the opponent, probably they haven't fought you either. And so they're probably going to be a little tentative too. So what do you need to learn? How do you stay safe while you learn? And how do you kill when your opponent tries to learn on you? That's the questions I want to cover. So the first thing I'm going to talk about here is active probing. Active probing is where I go to the edge of my lunging range, right? Depending on the opponent, I might do it just outside my measure. If I do it outside my measure, I can do experiments, especially if I'm also outside my opponent's measure. I can do experiments that are pretty darn safe because neither of us can reach each other, but my opponent might not be threatened by it. If I do something 3 inches outside of their reach and it's 1 inch outside of my reach, and I poke at your hand to see if you withdraw the hand and you do nothing, that might be a null result because you're well aware of the fact that I can't reach you in the first place, so you didn't bother responding. But a lot of opponents will overreact and will show you exactly what they intend to do, even though you're out of reach. So it doesn't hurt to juke a little bit out of reach and see if the opponent responds. If the opponent responds and overreacts to things you do when you're both out of measure, by all means, do your experiments out of measure. Show them something 6 times out of measure and then move into measure and use the counter tool for that as they get ready to overreact to the thing you've been doing from outside of measure. So when you do that, you're essentially going to do the first part of a tool. If the tool we're talking about is feint at the hand and then look for how to respond depending on their action, essentially go to the edge of lunging range and feint at their hand. Extend the arm toward the hand. Disengage, extend the arm toward the hand, and see what they do. And that's basically a probe. I'm not planning to follow through yet on either continuing to the body or on disengaging underneath and striking them in the flank, because I'm out of measure or I'm at the very edge of measure and I'm still collecting data. I'm not really ready to commit to that. I want to know what the answer is going to be before I commit myself to the fight. If I probe at the hand and they respond by extending the hand in second, which closes the line and threatens me at the same time, okay, that tool's not going to work. That tool is just going to get me stabbed and it's unlikely to yield much, all right? So most tools are going to have something where, depending on their response, the opponent either responds very well, showing you that that tool will get you in trouble, don't go there, right? Or that response may show you the defect in their fight that you can then exploit a little bit later. So things to look for. Did they parry? Did they void? Or did they ignore the feint or out of range shot? If I feint at your hand from the very edge of measure and you ignore it, I'm facing a reasonably clever opponent who understands measure and is unlikely to respond to that. Now, I might need to get just inside measure and try it again. So your opponent does nothing from out of measure, you need to get closer and try it again. If they parry, was there a single time counter in the response? This is really important. If I attack in the center and my opponent starts a counterattack in fourth, right? That is first of all, it's what they're going to do. That's nice to know. I could plan to intercept that with my dagger if I wanted to persist. But if someone makes the right single time counterattack, you need to rethink your actions. It's probably going to go badly for you. If somebody instead makes a parry or post, that indicates that you're going to have time to say, First they're going to defend, and then they're going to attack, which means I can attack and then I can defend. So if they parry, was the parry oversized? If I feinted the head, did they take their dagger and go like this? Or did they go like that? If they made an oversized parry, that indicates that I'm probably going to be able to attack underneath the parry. So I might, for instance, threaten the head, and then when they respond to the head, disengage underneath to the face. If they make just the right size parry, you're probably not going to be able to beat them with show one thing, move to another, show one thing, move to another, because they're just going to go, they're just going to take their dagger, and their dagger is going to go, yeah, while they're stabbing you. So that's not as likely to be helpful. But if they did make an oversized parry, what did it open up? That's probably a good place to look at aim your next attack. If they voided, if you attack someone and they stepped out of the way, was it a graceful sidestep or was it a leap back? A graceful sidestep means that they may very well gain distance when you make a feint or a probe or a more intent attack and put you in a position you don't want to be in. If you want to be optimistic about that, you can say, all right, well, when I attack here, they tend to jump over there, which can create an opportunity over there. If they leap back, that's a good sign. It can be a little frustrating. It can mean you're going to be leading to a longer fight because anytime you threaten your opponent, they're going to leap back. But it does mean that you can probably probe safely. You're going to be able to collect all the data you want, do all the experiments you want while they repeatedly leap back. And then when you've figured out how to actually kill them, then you're not going to give them the pleasantry of a feint. You're just going to hit them in the place that you need to hit them. You're going to like start an attack and immediately continue, or start an attack, close, and then continue, however is appropriate to the situation. Are they more comfortable in a static or a moving fight? So this is something that this is a way of probing that doesn't look like I'm doing anything. Is my opponent, but if we start on guard and I take a couple lateral steps one way or the other as I come to guard, does it look like every time I shift their stance, they go halfway batty? Or does it look like they're totally comfortable and they don't even want to set their feet? If you have somebody who, and I bring to mind Master Giovanni Orato from Artemisia on this. If I let that guy set his feet and plan his attack, I'm going to have a bad day. I'm not going to succeed by lining up in a Capoferro plate and trying to hit him and play the clever man play of 10A, right? He's going to win that fight because he's used to fighting with his feet set. So when I fight somebody who's comfortable fighting with set feet, I'm not going to give them the luxury of set feet. I'm going to keep the fight moving. I'm going to come in at one angle, shift, come in at another angle, and not let them set their back foot and plan an explosion in my direction. There are a lot of fighters who, when they set, have practiced their lunge and have a very powerful, very long lunge. And one of the best ways to prevent that is to not let them set the back foot. Moving will generally be safer for your active probing. The reason for that is that you can get out of range both backwards, but you can also get out of range laterally. Once you've set your feet and you're trying to do experiments from a fixed position, it's going to be harder to move out of the way. You really are going to have fewer options. Is there a defect in their guard that leaves an opening? If you feint there, do they start a complex counter? So I'll show an example of this. Apologize for the glare from the sun behind me. I'm going to get a little closer so that I'm blocking some of the glare. Something like this is a half moon guard from Body Damaso. If I were to show you this guard, you might feel that you could realistically attack in the head or shoulder over the guard. This is an invitation. If you do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend my arm forward. Your shot is going to immediately get picked up on my strong, and I'm going to strike you in the face, right? So if I see my opponent standing in a guard like this, one of two things is going on. Either they know what they're doing, or they're just holding their sword in a dumb way and they don't know what they're doing, right? So if I work from the edge of range and I think, gosh, maybe he's going to pop out like that, or maybe it's just a bad guard. Maybe his arm's tired and he doesn't even hold his elbow out, right? Notice my elbow's bent in this guard. If I'm fighting somebody who's just, doesn't really know what they're doing, right? If I come in, I like poke at this guard, and immediately I see that start, right? That's an invitation. Don't throw shots into invitations, and certainly don't throw committed shots into invitations, because that's how they're going to kill you, right? On the other hand, similarly, if someone's in some weird guard like this, they may very well have some complex thing going on that they plan to try next. Probe those, something that looks like an invitation, probe those with great care. But there are also cases where people will just, let me show you this one other thing. Here's an example of a defect, common defect I see that you can take advantage of. Let's say I'm constraining you, your sword's underneath mine, your sword's here. You disengage your sword, all of this at measure, of course. And instead of doing a proper constraint over here, with my arm in line with my sword, I do this kind of bent wrist thing. I don't know if you can see this, but there's about a 20 degree off angle between my wrist and my sword. And this will happen when someone goes from here to here without bothering to move the elbow. So I'm just pivoting my wrist back and forth. In this case, it's very easy to throw a shot from the outside that blows through this guard. The reason is that that's a really weak turn. And so if I can get my strong on your weak, I could just push your sword out of the way. If you attack me through here, my sword will end up here while you end up stabbing me in the throat. And so as you start to see more defects in guards, and you start to say, hey, I see an opening there, you start to figure out, hey, is that an invitation? Is it a trap? Or is it just a defect? And so poking at those defects is one of the best ways to do it. But be aware of the fact that if it's an invitation, something big is going to come back in your direction. And it's important you do it from the edge of measure on light feet, prepared to get the hell out. Also be prepared to just use your offhand weapon to clean up the mess as you pass backward and get the hell out of dodge. So if you realize you've probed into a trap and they're coming at you, feel free to use every run for the hills technique you have. Just block with both weapons while you pass your feet backward and get the heck out of their range. So don't be afraid to do that. Finally, how do they respond to shots between their weapons? This is something you need to know, especially in a two-weapon fight or somebody using their offhand, presenting their offhand in a single-weapon fight like they intend to use it. The reason for this is very important. Let us say that I'm fighting sword and dagger, and I'm in a guard that leaves an opening in the middle. But, I could potentially defend with the dagger, and I could potentially defend with the sword. This comes down to a matter of leverage. If you make a speed shot up the middle, and your speed shot is not going to generally have a lot of leverage. You're just going to be trying to beat me up the middle. Or perhaps you're trying to throw a combo of 2 or 3 of those. Block, 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 right? The dagger is going to have leverage on literally anything you can throw. It's all strong. It's going to block almost any sword shot that comes its way, right? And so there's very little point in trying to use your strong to gain leverage against my dagger. It's just going to slow down your attack. However, if my sword tries to engage and I try to block with the sword, and you gain leverage on the sword, you've got this huge lever arm of my weak to push out of the way and strike me. So if you see a guard where somebody could plausibly defend with one weapon or the other weapon, and you probe and you kind of feint up the middle, and you see that, great, you now know what they're going to do. They're planning to use the sword counterattack as the primary, while they probably use the dagger as a backup defense, right? Maybe here or maybe there. If you start attacking up the middle and they start, they immediately go for a beat downward, then they're going to use a dagger attack, right? The next thing you need to figure out in that quick situation is how quickly is that sword going to come out? So if I'm here and I feint high, feint low, and they go like this, chances are that counterattack is not coming until it's probably not going to come in my direction until they've actually touched my sword with their dagger. If I'm here and I attack over the dagger and they immediately go or under the dagger and they immediately go like this, then they're going to throw a prompt counterattack. You can see they're going to throw a prompt counterattack. One of the ways I can use the fact they're going to throw a prompt counterattack is that when you throw a prompt counterattack with no delay, the sword's probably going to go where it's pointed. So, if I'm in this situation and you attack my belly, and I go instantaneously go like this, probably that attack's coming at my head, and I can prepare to parry the headshot when that comes at my head. Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, understand how they're going to respond to a blow between the weapons. You can generally assume that if you attack on the outside of one weapon or the other, they're probably going to use the weapon on that side to defend with it. But if you attack up the middle, you need to know what kind of response they're going to have. That may affect what tool you use, but it could also just affect, hey, now I know what's coming. All right. Importantly, doing any kind of active probing where I'm poking at my opponent is going to alert the opponent to attacks on the probed line. So if I start poking at your hand, you're going to think more about the fact that there are shots coming at your hand. It might be the first couple times you withdraw your hand and you go, oh, hey, withdrawing the hand is dumb. I really should be pushing that out. Or you might just start overreacting one way or the other. But the key point is that whatever you probe is probably going to set up the counter tool to that probe because you're showing them, you're getting them thinking about that attack. Similarly, if you're fighting in practice and you hit somebody the same way twice, they're going to start over-defending that line. And the key is to say, hey, what does that open up? That's neat. That opens up the other shoulder. Maybe I should feint there and attack the other shoulder. And that can also be a way to build the tool as well as to understand the fighter in the fight. And then obviously once you've, just like I was saying before, if I threaten one line and you start reacting that line and then I disengage underneath, a lot of times people will say, oh, I see the trick. And that can open up the original line even further. So if I go, go here and you go, I'm going to attack there, right? Now I can come right back. Once you think that you've figured out my trick, I can frequently go back to the original attack. Or I could take advantage of the thing that you're now doing in response. Now, when I first taught this class, I approached it a little too much from the perspective of a tall, fast guy. I probably taught this class, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. And one of the holes in it was, what do you do when you can't just reach out and poke the opponent before they can do anything useful in response? What do you do when you're giving up a foot of reach or 6 inches of reach? And how do you let the other fighter come to you? It may be necessary against an aggressive opponent or one with reach, but generally speaking, even when I'm fighting somebody, someone small like Maestro Lot, I still, they still have an opportunity to let them come to me and use what they're doing against them. So the next part of the class, I want to talk about how to fight when you need to let your opponent come to you, or you want to let your opponent come to you. So the first thing to look for is what's their range and at what distance do they want to attack. I'm assuming here they're tall, they have reach. So you want to make sure you know where you're safe. You need to understand their measure, or at least have a conservative guess of it, so you don't get skewered before you're prepared to execute a counter. If they choose to attack from the edge of their measure, if they're like, hey, I have reach, I'm going to get to the edge of my lunging range and I'm going to attack, that can favor a counter. So it can especially favor if someone wants to lunge from the very edge of their range. It can be letting them think they're in range, letting them get to the very edge of range. And then when they attack, seeding measure out of range. So if I'm here, you've got 1.5 miles of reach on me. I let you get to the edge of your measure. You're planning your point right in the middle of the rows. As you attack, even if you have leverage, even if you're pushing my sword out of the way, if I rock back on my back knee, you're now out of measure. So I can let you get to the edge of measure. If you look like you want to throw a long attack, by all means, please throw an attack from the edge of your measure. That will work great for me. And as you throw a shot from the edge of measure, right, and you maybe even push my sword out of the way, I lean back, put my strong on your weak, and then I can come forward and strike you. So if you're polite, if you have reach and you're polite enough to attack from the very farthest away you can attack, I will encourage that. If they prefer to attack from short range, then even if they have measure, it can give you an opportunity to make an active attack. You may still be put into a reactive tool situation or reactive probing, but it means that you may get the opportunity to make an attack even if they have reach. Which side do they prefer to attack? You can try setting up inside and outside of center. You can say, yeah, let me give you a little bit more room on the outside, or let me give you a little more room on the inside, and see which way they seem inclined to attack. Again, you need to do this at a range where you can get the heck out if things go south. You can also try high and low. You know, if you take a high guard with your hands up here, do they seem to want to attack the belly? If you take a low guard, will they go for the head? See where you can attract an attack. And that matters for a couple reasons. The first one is that if you can convince them to attack you, then you will probably know where they're going to attack. If by creating a momentary opening you can get them to attack, then you know both when and where they're going to attack, which is even better. How quickly do they free their sword from a sticky parry? This is important. If someone reaches out to try to poke at you and you get your dagger on it, you kind of follow with the dagger, do they immediately bounce off, or do they kind of wrestle with the dagger? If they wrestle with the dagger, you may be able to bind forward as you come forward to attack. If they immediately bounce off, binding isn't going to help you, and you're going to have to immediately come down and close another line. And then how quickly can they, this is really important, how quickly or do they throw a second attack after your initial defense? So if I create an opening with my dagger, I open my left shoulder, as perhaps I step forward and open my left shoulder, and they immediately attack the left shoulder and I go to close it, do they even get to the point of touching my dagger before they change lines, right? If they actually touch the dagger, does it stick for a little bit? Or do they keep pushing against the closed line? Or do they immediately bounce off? So those are things you need to know in terms of choosing how to approach your opponent. And do they immediately throw the second attack, or do they just bounce off? Again, is there a defect in their guard, or is there a defect in their attacker guard? If, for instance, they attack with the hand and the foot at the same time, and the foot immediately goes kaploy, and the whole body jumps forward, that's a person who's overcommitting to an attack, and that will give you an opportunity to deal with that. Do they telegraph? One thing I would highly recommend for shorter fighters, or good practice generally, but a shorter fighter rarely is going to launch an attack from outside of measure, is watch your opponent for telegraphs. Get to the very edge of their measure to a position where they could maybe hit you from there, right? Give them an opening. When they attack, fully prepare to step back, just step out of range. But look and see, do they pump the arm before they attack? Do they drop their hips before they attack? Is there some sign the attack is coming so that you can be well aware when the attack is coming and be more confident in your counter? One of the neat things is that when somebody telegraphs, they're almost certainly committed to the line they're on. I very rarely see someone pull their arm back and then throw a looping shot. They're pulling their arm back to power on the line they're on, which means your committed counterattack on that line should work really well, but you better put your body behind it because they're planning on punching through steel to get to you. So, ways of looking at it. Do they seek to constrain your sword? This is very important. If you're a shorter fighter and you let your opponent constrain you and then you let them get to measure, you're probably in trouble, especially if they're getting to any kind of medium range. With a constraint, you ought to be dead. So not being there is very important. How do they respond to your constraint, or do they respond at all? There are still a lot of fighters out there who learned a decade and a half ago who maybe completely ignore constraint. So the basic idea of constraint, let's imagine that you're pointing your sword right about here, somewhere on this side. I want to position my sword, perhaps somewhere like this, so that in order to attack that position you're aiming at, you'd have to deal with the fact that my sword is in your way and the line is closed. If I'm in a position, say here, let's say your face is near where the center of the camera is, and your sword is under mine, I'm in a position where I can strike directly on the camera. You can strike the camera, but you can't strike directly on that line. There's a variation on this, where I might do something like this, and give you a little more opening, where you could theoretically get to me, but when I extend my arm, I will close that line. that make sense? So I can either close the line completely, so you can't get here, or I can show you a little bit of the line, but make it so that my counterattack will close that line when I thrust. The second one's a little more subtle, but it can be open to being blown through. If I kind of do a really weak constraint and you put your strong on my middle of my sword, you may be able to push through it. I think I would be clever and push your sword out of the way. In reality, I end up over here and I get stabbed in the chest. So the key point is, make sure you take away your opponent's straight line to target before you do things like walk into their range and see how they want to try to hit you. You can constrain with, Dagger. If someone's in a low guard, I can bring my point down here so that they're straight line to my middle chest from a right low guard. So right low guard is going to be, they're going to be holding their sword down where the point of my sword is down there. I can turn my sword like this. If they're in a high guard, I can constrain the high guard by putting my dagger up like this. You can push it out a little bit more so they don't have a straight line to my head without having to go around my weapon. Similarly, I can do this. This is my generic buckler guard is hold your arm out straight, aim it at their hilt. By definition, they now have to go around your buckler. So if your buckler is there, your sword is there, and I hold this directly at your hilt, any attack you try to make going past my hilt is going to get pushed offline. And then all I have to do is track your hilt with my buckler. So interpose something. It's even better if you interpose your sword, because then if I've interposed my sword, then if my opponent attacks, all I do is extend my arm, and now I'm threatening them in addition to defending. If I interpose a different offhand weapon, then I just need to take responsibility for making sure I also simultaneously attack to make that work. But some people will not respond to constraint. When I first learned what constraint was, it was probably 2007 or something like that. I could constrain somebody. And someone like test it. Okay, I'll take an advantage. That's great. Because basically, I can hit you and you can't hit me. That's a good position to be in, especially if my opponent has reach. A couple other points. Don't forget you can probe from a refused guard. If you're giving up a lot of reach, there's no reason that I can't, take a buckler here. My opponent has a mile of reach. I'm awfully safe back here. I'm not real worried about getting hit. I could say step forward and offer a little bit of head to see whether you'll take the headshot. And then if you take the headshot, I could close with a sword. I could compass to gain distance. There's lots of things I can do. But if I'm nervous about facing an opponent, I put my left foot forward or my offhand foot forward, and I put my offhand up in front of me. I can be very, very safe while moving around. And the other nice thing about this is if I'm giving up a lot of reach and I'm very, very safe and my opponent's frustrated, even though he's got a mile of reach that he can't easily hit me, he's going to eventually become more responsive to invitations. If my opponent's been trying to figure out how to help me get past this buckler for the last minute and a half, and I'm fighting somebody who's 7 feet tall, and then I suddenly show them an opening, this makes it more likely, especially if I show them the opening as I advance, or show the opening in advance, you think, I'm going to blow through that. And I'm like, great, I'm going to close that line with my sword and stab you in the chest. So that could be an example of how a short fighter can cover a lot of distance, create an opening, and then use it against their opponent. Finally, where are the long tempos that you can counter? Where does your opponent give you a great heaping amount of time? There's a few that I see that are probably the biggest one is taking big steps in measure without presenting the sword. So if I'm fighting an opponent, or if I'm watching my opponent, and here we are, we're in guard, we're fighting, and they decide they're going to take their right foot. We'll go to the side of the camera, you can see it. You can't see this, but imagine it. I'm going to take my right foot, I'm going to pick it up, I'll move it over there. And move my other foot behind it, right? Why am I circling? I don't know, but there's a lot of people who just get bored and want to circle, and they want to circle and measure sometimes. While my right foot is in the air, whee, like that, I can't lunge. I'm not going anywhere. I have no particular leverage on my front foot. I have almost no chance of being able to shoot in this direction. Like, that's kind of throwing off your back foot. Sure, I can throw this direction because I'm going that way. I can kind of make a lateral lunge. But my options are really limited. And a lot of people take big steps in measure for no good reason. The other opportunity you'll frequently have is somebody who's taller than you, but takes a big step into measure. You can especially do this against short fighters if you're the tall fighter. But most short fighters are more careful about this. But a lot of tall fighters will start out of measure. They'll be like, yeah, you can't reach me. Well, I'm going to step into measure. Right? If they were clever and they went sneaking in, sneaking in, sneaking in, sneaking in, right, then you wouldn't have had that opportunity. But if somebody picks up their foot and goes, go into measure, then if I'm a short fighter and I want to get close, I can advance at the same time they're galumphing. Or if they're actually stupid enough to step into my measure, I want my lunge to arrive at the same time they do, right? Because as their foot's in there and they're stepping forward, they're not in a position to attack. Their lever arm is all the way tied to their back foot. So look for those long tempos that you can use. Also, sometimes people swing their swords around. Those can be long tempos if they become habitual. Okay. Generally speaking, you rarely throw, remember we're talking about probing here, we're talking about feeling out the opponent. Generally speaking, you're rarely going to throw a full speed counter in reactive probing unless they simultaneously throw a committed attack to your body. So instead what you're going to do is you're going to cede distance, you're going to stay safe until you think you see a weakness. You're like, hey, it looks like it's really predictable they're going to do this. And then you're going to show them that small opening, and you're going to see how they react to that small opening as a test. You're not just going to jump into it, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to stay out of range, and then you're going to maybe make a small step forward showing them an opening. And you're going to see, do they go for that opening? If they go for that opening, how did they go for that opening? Did they do what you thought they were going to do, or did they do something completely different? The neat thing about this is you can basically do this from the edge of measure. You can do it from a little too far away. You could show them an opening. For instance, and I'll cover this a little later on how to do invitations. I can, let's say I'm fighting somebody 7 feet tall, right? I can come from a relatively balanced guard. I can, on my step forward, show a little bit of shoulder. I go, hey, I see that thing. I see that thing. He's doing this dumb thing wrong. I bet I can hit him right through there. And of course, what I want him to do is to take that shot, and then I'm going to counter it. But I want to see whether he's even inclined to take that shot. One of the neat things is that when I poke at your hand repeatedly, right, you're going to start thinking, if I'm doing active probing your hand, you're going to start thinking, hey, he wants to hit my hand, right? But if I repeatedly show you an opening to my shoulder, that even though it's out of measure, and maybe when you went to attack it, I leapt back so that you never actually got there, you're not going to think, hey, that's a trap, and he keeps showing you that trap. I bet I'm being suckered. You're going to think, he's doing this thing wrong, and I'm totally going to hit him there the next time he does it. So don't worry about, you can repeatedly show the same invitation. Just be real careful while you do it until you know how your opponent's going to react and whether they're going to do what they're supposed to do. So you want them to underestimate your counterattack and think, if I keep trying, I'll get through. If they press, though, either break the engagement or go for the kill. Don't get caught doing an experiment with someone who wants to run you down, right? So you should always be planning, if I'm going to show an opening, you want to be prepared to actually execute the move in case they, do a full leaping lunge at you and give you a really good opportunity to do it, or if they start, they're going to start pressing you. So either get the hell out or commit to the counterattack. But for the most part, if I show an invitation and someone goes for it, I'm just going to look as though I went, oh gosh, there's an opening, close, back up. And then the next time they do it, they go, oh gosh, there's an opening. Okay, now I know where they're opening. Now I know how they want to attack an opening. Difference is that whereas with an offensive probe or an active probe, the third time you do it, they're going to catch on. With a passive probe, usually the reactive probe, usually the more times you show it to them, the more likely they are to commit to it. Alternately, if you're already comfortable with fighting defensively or reactively, and you already know how to execute a counter, you can just come forward, show an opening, and if they do the thing, just hit them with it. Like, it doesn't have to be, everything doesn't have to be a science experiment. If you are comfortable throwing the counter and you don't need to see it several times in advance to see exactly how they're going to show it, okay, cool, hit them before they learn. Show them in the opening, and if they go for it, just execute the counter. Next thing I want to talk about is opponent management in a fight, opponent management and using your tools. So some good habits. During salutes and lay on, you need to focus your mind and body however you do that best. And this is me cheating and throwing things that I do that are maybe not related to this class, but are kind of tangential in here. You need to focus your mind and body however you do that. You're not going to be able to go in and outthink your opponent if you're, gosh, I'm hungry and I need to do this thing at X and I don't even have time between the fights. You need to focus your mind and body in the here and now, however you do that best. Don't say you're ready until you're ready. So I don't know the 8-melt custom, but generally speaking, you ask the fighters whether they're ready. Don't say yes until you are. If you need 15 seconds before you say yes, take 15 seconds. If you're in a final and you need a minute, I watched a crown final combatant take a minute to meditate before calling lay on, before saying they were ready to fight in a crown final. And everyone waited for them, and then they mowed down their opponent 2-0. So if you need the time to focus, take the time to focus. However, once lay on is called, show confidence and good form. There is a morale balance in a fight. If you come across as meek, there are ways you can use that to manipulate your opponent, but most of them aren't that good. Mostly making your opponent nervous by going forward with confidence, good body posture, good strength, having your core engaged will do a lot to show a good posture and a good body strength. That's going to cause your opponent to feel uncertain, which especially in an active probing where you're coming at them is going to make them a lot less dangerous to you. Once you're in range, this is not the place to choose your tools. This is not the place to plan. If you need to think, right? If you want to step forward, I'm going to see what I got. Hey, it looks kind of like I'm outside of measure, but I'm looking, I'm juking, I'm seeing what they're responding to, I'm playing with some things. Once I get into measure, I need to have a plan. Don't get to measure without having a plan. It's not a good idea. If you're in the middle of the fight and you need to stop and choose your tools or do your thinking, the best way I've found to do this is obviously against some opponents. Against some opponents, if you just step back, they'll step back too. They'll lower their sword, they'll relax. That's great if they'll let you do it. There are some opponents who, if you step back, will just step forward. If you need time out of measure to think, the best way that I've found to do it, demonstrate this, is to purposefully take 2 steps backward in a pass. So I'm in guard, remembering that morale balance is a thing, and I don't want to just like blink backwards like this, because then my opponent will probably follow me, right? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass backwards, pass my right foot behind my left, boom, boom. And then having done that, if they look like they want to follow me, I will just start circling. So get the hell out of measure, and then I'll start circling. I'll do it purposefully to make it look like I'm a dangerous animal, and they don't want to be following a dangerous animal at this particular moment. They just want to, they might circle in response. But that will buy me the 10 seconds I need to clear my brain to go, oh, hey, that's not going to work. Shit, what am I going to do next? So that's important, is to have the ability to step away from the fight. And you can do that by stepping back purposefully, circling purposefully, rather than kind of slinking back and then maybe have your opponent follow you all over the place. But then when you're ready to engage, you want to step forward purposefully, unless you're suckering. There's just as a brief anecdote, something that I've sometimes taught smaller fighters who are fighting against somebody who's overconfident is one of the things you can do is you can come out, low body motion posture, kind of look harmless. Whenever your opponent attacks, back up and parry, back up and parry, back up and parry. When they look like they're ready to get you, or you've shown them that 3 times, then when they attack, you set your back foot and counter purposefully. And if you haven't been showing any counterattacks up to that point, they might very well have their dagger asleep on their guard. They're like, I'm just going to stab this guy in the face. And then you counter purposefully and frequently will catch their, if your sword's been asleep, you can lull their offhand weapon to sleep and then parry with your offhand and stab them in the chest. And that works distressingly well. Okay. Controlling the flow of the fight is almost always advisable. There's two ways to do this. One is again, your active and your reactive. In active control of the fight, you're going to drive the action. You're going to put the opponent in a reactive role. If you're doing German, this is the Vor and the Nach. You're going to come out, you're going to control the fight, you're going to be the one throwing the shots, you're going to move purposefully, you're going to be the one who moves backwards and forwards to control measure. And that gives you, that allows you to put the opponent on the back foot, make them constantly going, oh gosh, what do I do next? Uh-oh, they did this. You want to trap their brain in a reactive state where they're not being productively reactive. They're just going, oh God, how do I respond? You want the wide eyes with deer in headlights effect here. This is most useful when you have a range or quickness advantage. You're going to use it differently depending on how you have. If I have a range advantage against someone, but not a quickness advantage, then my active control of the fight is going to be working my way to my long lunge range, but outside of their long lunge range, and then repeatedly making threats until I see where they cover badly or where they overreact, and then aiming to hit on the other side. So again, like all of the words of the first hour sound pretty complicated because I'm structuring it as a meta. I don't know you. I don't know what your strengths are. And it's going to vary from each person. But if I'm using a range advantage through active control in a fight, what I'm doing is I'm going to the edge of my measure. I'm repeatedly showing threats. I'm trying to constrain. I'm trying to put myself in a safe position where I can repeatedly make threats that are maybe low percentage, but I can make them safely until I find where my opponent does something wrong, and that's where I'm going to commit to my attack. So that's a way to use range. If I don't have range, but I have quickness, right, then what I need to do, this is important, what I need to do is I need to get to this is me having less measure. Either I need to be outside of their lunging measure, or I need to be inside of my lunging measure, because there's a no man's land where they can hit me and I can't hit them, and I do not want to spend the fight there. So if I'm fighting someone with 6 inches of reach on me, but I'm quicker than them, I'm going to stay way the hell out of range until I can get into my lunging range and through their lunging range, to the point where their 45-inch blade and their long arms, they start to feel kind of cramped like a monkey, and I'm free to use the full extension of my arms. So that's sort of the key approach to how I use that kind of reach advantage. I need to be able to get into a range where I can threaten them and make them uncomfortable. Alternatively, let's say you don't have those things. This is where you come into passive or reactive control of the fight. You let your opponent think they're driving the action of the fight, but you limit their options. You show them where you want them to go via the guard you're taking and the options you're giving them. If you take a very defensive position, you're going to force them to kind of try to overwhelm that bunker. Just like I hold out that buckler and I refuse my sword, I'm basically making you have to deal with this buckler first. If, on the other hand, I show you an opening and you say, hey, I'm going to attack his head over there, then I'm taking control of the fight by driving the opponent's creative process. So those are both good. Controlling distance is the key. If my opponent has reach, I need them to either be out of measure or I need to be all the way in my measure. Although there is a space, if you like to do counterattacks, of being at the very edge of their measure to encourage them to take long attacks that are low percentage that you can then counter. One of the ways, if you're dealing with a tall, quick fighter, which is sort of the worst case scenario, is somebody who's taller and quicker than you, is you need to basically be able to get into your distance without getting killed getting there. That can be very difficult. One of the best ways to do that is to convince your opponent to do something that comes forward, and then you come forward at the same time. So, for instance, I might go to the edge of a taller, faster, quicker opponent's range, convince them, show them an opening, convince them to throw the attack, and in the time of their attack, rather than trying to counterattack it, I might cover really strongly while I step in and get to a measure that makes them deeply uncomfortable. where they're kind of trying to fight with bent elbows, and I'm now able to aggressively come forward right up the middle. So a couple of different ways to approach that. If you want to initiate the attack, then you need to stay out of their lunging range and attack when they advance into their range. So one of the ways you can approach that is you stay just outside of their measure, so they get frustrated with the fact that they can't reach you. And then when they take the tempo to step forward into their measure, use the fact that they got long ass legs, and it takes a long time to unfurl long legs. And as they step too far into measure, that's when you launch your attack. But that's still a passive control of the fight, where you're setting up just annoyingly far enough away from your opponent where they feel the need to step forward. You're now essentially forcing your opponent's actions. One thing I will say is this can result in really tediously long fights if your opponent won't take that bait. It's frustrating. Normally, I'm one of those people who will yell at fighters after the fight if they make the fight drag for 5 to 10 minutes. But if you're facing someone who is taller and quicker than you, by all means, stay outside of their measure and make them come to you. It's on them to commit to making something happen in the fight. It's not your job as a short fighter to try to run down the opponent's throat just to make something happen because they won't act. Next thing I want to talk about is manipulating the opponent. If you are doing active probing, you want to use safe shots to set up the counter tool. You don't want to take actions that are going to leave you exposed to losing an arm or getting stabbed in the face while you're threatening someone's wrist. That's totally counter to the entire philosophy. The goal is to set up a foundation, frequently involving a constraint, but sometimes just including an offhand weapon that closes the opponent's direct line to target, and then take essentially low percentage safe shots. Those low percentage safe shots might land. That's not their point. The point of the safe shots is to set up your opponent for something else. Either show them something so they're more likely to overreact to it the next time you do it, or to say, oh, I see they've got this defect, so that's how you're trying to use your safe shots. If you're using your offhand weapon, try to put 90% of when you're doing these experiments or you're poking around at your opponent or try to set them up, try to put 90% of your focus into defending with your offhand weapon while you attack. Just fire and forget. You're like, oh, I'm going to threaten your hand while I defend with my dagger, which is getting all of my attention. And focus on their sword hilt. You know, I've got my offhand weapon, I'm watching your sword hilt. The sword doesn't move without the hilt, so just be focused there. Basically it also allows you to focus on what they're doing, because you're not trying to precisely target a shot. You're just trying to observe the opponent, observe their attack, and observe getting the hell out of the way. Without an offhand weapon, you're going to need to stick and move. If you are getting to the edge of measure and poking at people, you're giving them tempos at a range where they can take advantage of it. So you need to come in, do your thing, get the heck out if you're just trying to set them up for something, if you're just trying to do an experiment. If there's no safe shot in range, you can try shooting from out of range and seeing if the opponent responds or starts sensitizing to that attack. Then that will set up the counter tool. But if you work from out of range, recognize that it's a flawed experiment, and if the opponent does nothing, it's probably because they recognize you're not a threat yet. When you're doing those attacks, repeat attacks no more than twice. The third attack on the same line needs to turn into a counter tool attack just as they're starting to understand the initial attack. If you fight somebody who you show a thing once and then they murder you the second time you do it, I'm sorry, very typical. On the passive side of things, in order to control the opponent in a way that you can use, in order to set up your opponent for something, an invitation needs to control not just where you leave the opening, but when you leave the opening. If someone comes out and here I am, I'm on guard, shoot a really obvious one like this, right? This is an invitation. This says, I want you to hit my head, right? Here I am, here's a normal guard, there's my head. My dagger's low, obviously I'm inviting the head, right? If I do this just standing there, I'm essentially teasing the opponent, saying, hey, bet you can't hit my head, bet you can't hit my head, bet you can't hit my head. But a thinking opponent is going to realize that this is a trap. As soon as they go for the head's going backwards, and the dagger's coming up. That should be obvious, right? I mean, maybe they're really planning on getting under it like that, but regardless, and that's one of the reasons you want to probe that, right? So if someone's standing like this, and I make a quick feint to the head and they go like this, you should be able to see what's happening, right? Sword's coming up, dagger's coming up, head's going back. They're going to try to counter like that. If I attack to the head and it goes like, and right here, I think like this, well, then I know where that's going. If I threw a shot with enough range where they can hit me, when they do that, shame on me. That was a dumb place to throw a shot from. That was a dumb active probe against that invitation. So if I want someone to actually attack me, my invitation properly, if I stand like this, and I leave that invitation, they should either ignore it because it's obviously not a natural opening, or they should feint it. And when I go like this, stab me, come underneath and stab me in the chest, right? So if I want to make them actually respond to what I want, if I'm the fighter trying to use reactive probing, I need them to attack with intent and see it as a legitimate opportunity, not just a trap they have to outsmart. Like if they see it as a mousetrap, they have to like, they have to deactivate, then my technique is probably not going to work. I'm probably just going to, essentially put myself into a situation where I don't know how they're going to react. As the reactive fighter, I need to know how they're going to react, and I need to know when they're going to react. So if I'm here, right, and I don't know if you're going to actually attack my head or feint at my head and attack my belly, this isn't a good invitation because it creates a situation where they're likely going to do something unpredictable. So if I want to make them do something predictable, what I want to do is I want to create a place and a time of their attack so that either they take that opportunity or they curse themselves for not taking that opportunity, right? So if I'm here, here's a nice neutral guard, and I say make a slight offline step forward and move my dagger out of the way, creating an opportunity, right? And then immediately correct it. And I show my opponent that, and they go, hey, there was an opening there for a second. And then later on in the fight, I step like this again and close the line a smidge late. After a couple times they've seen that, and they're thinking, hey, I bet I can hit him there. And so as I start to go this way, they start to initiate their attack, right? Except that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted them to see an opening so I could counter with the sword, right? And that's not going to work unless they've probably seen it once before. But the first time you do it, you probably, you don't quite know how they're going to respond to it, so be prepared to bail out. The first time I do that, maybe I go like this, and as soon as I see them coming, I cover and get the hell out. I go, oh God, I made a mistake, cover up. My opponent is not thinking, hey, that was a trap they were testing. My opponent is thinking, they barely covered that. I totally hit next time if I'm a little faster. So next time they try it, right, I show them that opening. As soon as I create that opening, they go for it, and now I make my counterattack and kill. So that's sort of how you go about making invitations, is you need to create the place and time of the attacks you control, but not only where they attack, but when. Also, don't underestimate confidence and momentum in a fight. Project your confidence. If you just barely missed, the opponent's probably nervous and they may overreact to feints. So in addition to projecting confidence, be aware of it. If you almost hit your opponent, probably they're not going to choose that moment to make their confident motion forward. Probably they're going to look to fall back and kind of recover their confidence. Against a very strong opponent, it's okay, but at that time, when they're stepping back, they're less likely to aggressively respond to an invitation because they're unsettled by the fact that they almost got hit. So as I said before, against a very strong opponent, you can try to be underestimated. You can close out of nowhere. This is frequently the tactic of a shorter fighter, is to show an opening and they just keep coming forward. But you have to control their sword to do it. This is a case where it's worth noting that if you're fighting an opponent who is likely to beat you, who's going to beat you 9 times out of 10, take the best opportunities you have. Don't just go into a tournament fight, go, oh, I'm going to lose. I guess I'm just going to do my thing as best I can and hope I hit them, because that's never going to work, right? You're going to have to take risks when you're fighting a much better fighter in order to hit them. And a lot of people with hankies and collars will flail after their first couple steps back. They're used to taking 1 or 2 steps back. They're not used to running for the ropes. And so once you unsettle them and kind of get them moving backwards, frequently you can get them to open up something and kill them. And if you do find yourself in that situation where you like your opening creates an opportunity to get inside their guard and then you start chasing them down, the key is just keep blocking their attacks with your offhand and just calmly keep trying to stab them with your sword while you just focus on staying alive. And you're moving forward and they're moving backward and they're stumbling and you're confidently walking. Just keep walking and stabbing and you'll be fine. Let's talk about changing your plan. If a tool set is making progress, if you're attacking, you're probing safely, and then you're attacking safely, and then that's setting up counter tools and you're using that, just focus on that. You don't need to try 6 different things in a fight. You only need one to work. So if I, for example, if I'm, for example, I'm setting up a, just like that hand shot thing, or my opponent is giving me constraint and I'm just going to go straight for the head, and then I'm going to overreact to their giant parry to protect their head by disengaging and hitting them in the belly, which is another simple tool, right? If I get a constraint, paint the head, or start to attack the head. If they go like this, hit them in the belly. So if that's working, if it's showing promise, stick with it. Use it to kill your opponent. The whole point of tools and counter tools is I've got A and I've got B, and when you overreact to A, I kill you with B, or vice versa. However, if it's not working, let's say I try, I constrain my opponent and I start to threaten the head and I realize, oh dear, they've managed to sneak into a half moon guard and now they're counterattacking with the sword. I'm going to get out and I'm going to rethink. I'm going to go home and rethink my life. And so once I do that, a break off, I prefer to break engagement before switching my plans, before switching my tool sets. And that's largely to give my brain time to process the fact that I'm doing something else. I don't want to come back and be thinking about, oh, hey, I have constraint, maybe I could, but also there's that hand, maybe that's how you get stabbed in the face, because you're thinking in measure. If I want to go off and say, that didn't work, clear my thoughts, I'm going to take a double pass back, circle up a couple times, come back in and look for the next thing. And that's how I'll approach it. If something is working but it's not quite there, you thought it was going to work, didn't work, frequently what I'll do is I'll break off contact, I'll come back in and I'll try something else, right? And then once maybe I'll come back in at a different guard, right? I'll get them thinking about something completely different. And then I will, having been in that headspace, I should be able to pop back into it. So I might be like, hey, I'm going to go with a really defensive posture here that you haven't seen before, but then I'm going to switch back to the position I was in the first time through, and I'm going to set up my tool and counter tool. So I'll basically get their mind off it with something else, and then I'll come back to the thing if it needs to be revisited. Once you've felt out a couple of different things in a fight, it becomes easier to switch between the two. If you're fighting in a sword and dagger fight, and you're giving up range, and so you're trying to figure out how you're going to fight your opponent. Can't see this, my right foot is forward, right? My right foot is forward, I'm playing around with some invitations and some sword counters, but that's not quite getting through, but it has promise, it's just not getting there. And then I switch to my right foot back and bring both my weapons in here, it's a little better, right? This now is looking to make kind of quickly expand with a passing step to cover the measure. Whereas, so in this guard, my right foot is back, and I'm looking to, as soon as my opponent starts to threaten, I get strong on weak, and I carry that strong and weak through a pass. In this guard with my right foot forward, right, I'm looking to maybe show an opening, and then when they attack in the middle, I'm looking to simultaneously lunge and close the distance. As they step forward, I step forward too, to cover the extra measure of being a short fighter. So once I've done that, right, and I'm sorry, apologies. Once I've done that, now I can change between those two tools in the fight. And I should be able to switch faster than my opponent to switch, because I'm just going between the two things I've most recently done. And they're going, oh, hey, is that guard again? So for instance, here I am, right? If you press me, I bring my right foot back. As I bring my right foot back, right, I take this guard. Now all of a sudden you're uncomfortable, so I step forward. Well, now I'm in this guard, right? And for instance, if one of my tools from a right foot forward guard is maybe I'll parry with the dagger and maybe I'll parry with the sword, then I can have 3 major threats running, in this case, I've got either sword counter or dagger counter, right? And here I'm going to dive underneath and attack you with a pass. And I can start running once I've spent some time in the fight and things didn't work the first time, I will be able to switch between the options a little more quickly than you will, especially if you practice that. If you go and practice, you say, hey, I'm going to practice these two things. Like when my right foot's forward, I'm going to do this. When my left foot forward, I'm going to do that. And you just switch between those things. Not only will that make it more interesting to fight somebody 20 times in a row, but it'll also allow you to practice switching between those tools. But if you're going to do that, stick to two things. Stick to two tool sets. Don't try to stick to like 3 different tool sets. At least I can't, and I'm ADHD. But I try to do 3 or 4 things at once. I'm just not going to do any of them well. And the reason you're not going to do anything well is that you need to be watching for things. You need to be setting things up. And if I'm trying to create a pattern with active probing where I do 4 different things, it's probably not going to work real well. If I try to set something up that's trying to do 2 things, the pattern's going to be more recognizable. All right. Lastly, learning from a fight. When you get hit, ask how they got you. So you're fighting, when you're in a fight, you fought a challenge, whether it's, especially if it's in a tournament, make a point of learning from your losses. Losses are valuable. Make sure you don't waste them. When you get hit, make sure you understand how they got you. If it's obvious to you and you're like, gosh, totally got hit that way, it may still be worth asking, what did you see? Why did I get hit there? I thought I totally had that covered, and did I not make the parry in time? They may have seen something you didn't see that you weren't aware of. If you have no idea, ask them to back up and rework, essentially, give me a slow-mo rewind of how you just killed me. Often that slow-mo rewind, most people, if I'm explaining to somebody how I killed them, I will totally be happy to spend 5 minutes being, okay, here's how I think I killed you. And then you go, hey, could we make that into a quick drill? Make it into a quick drill, be like, okay, here's the tool. Okay, well, what does that open up? Well, I guess that opens up that. Okay, so for 5 minutes after a fight, I turned a tournament loss into an A-B drill that I can then go off and play with. It's also worth noting, what can your opponent do to you, right? Your opponent may be trying things you haven't seen before. And so what can be done to you, where your weaknesses are, is crucial. If you won, please offer the same courtesy to your opponent. You might even ask them politely whether they've got brain to talk about the fight. And if they do, encourage them to go through what went wrong. If the ending's very straightforward, instead of setting your focus on how well you, instead of setting your focus on what happened, because I just stabbed the guy in the face because he left his head open, give some thought to rewinding and seeing what you saw, what else you could have done, why what you did went well or went poorly. Couple of pointers for practicing now. Most people practice in an unplanned manner. This may be different. It really depends on the culture that the lead teacher at a practice sets. But most people that I've experienced go to practice and they spar. And they may not spar with anything particularly in mind, or they might, but they don't communicate about it. They certainly don't tell their opponent what they're working on. And so as a result, a lot of unplanned stuff happens and you don't get much focused improvement. So first of all, be willing to fight everyone. In addition to the teaching benefit of working with beginners, they'll teach you different things because they're doing weird stuff you've never seen before because they're making this stuff up as they go along. And it's worth seeing those things. Second of all, in a fight, when you're fighting someone, pick something to work on. Pick something that's suitable to the opponent's skill level. Don't work on, if you want to work on if you want to work on your counterattacks and invitations and counterattacks, beginners are great places to do that. Show them a big frickin' opening. Get them to attack it. Counterattack them. Don't be a jerk and hit them 5 times in a row in the same place. Switch it up. Let them know after a couple times what you're doing so they can learn from it. Generally speaking, doing probing against regular sparring partners doesn't work so well because they've seen your fights lots of times. So new fighters can be great for that, or people coming from other practices who don't regularly fight aren't already attuned to what you're going to do. And finally, recognize that drill-like controlled sparring has a lot more to teach you than trying to outspeed your opponent. If you go into a fight and you're like, I'm going to hit you as fast as I can, totally getting up, totally getting up, boom, right? That doesn't really teach you anything. You can practice your lunge speed at home. It maybe helps you aim them a little better and time them a little better. But you would learn a lot more if you were focusing on a particular thing other than just trying to, win more of the fights than they do. Also, talk to your opponent about, or talk to your practice partner about what they want to work on, and be willing to work on their things too. Because often the thing they're working on may be a thing you didn't know you needed, or maybe a thing you need to focus on the skills of. Especially with a beginner, just practicing sword counterattacks in time is probably the only reason I ever learned how to do it well. Is I taught it to 50 people. Now, when you're sparring, choose what you're trying to do, tune that to your opponent. So against the beginning fighter, practice your fundamentals together. The goal when you're fighting with a beginner fighter is to improve them, right? It's a service. People took that service for you. Be willing to do that service for them. So stick to basic attacks they've been trained to counter. Throw your shots at a speed where they can counter them if they do it properly. That might be pretty slow. If I'm fighting with a beginner, I might be fighting at 50 or 60% speed. But when you're fighting at 50 or 60% speed, you can focus on making your form perfect. You can practice, extending the arm with a good tricep, with good tricep action. You can focus on smoothly turning the extension of the arm into a lean of the body into a lunge, or practicing whatever lunge you feel like doing, right? That's your opportunity to work on your fundamentals, because you need to be going at 60% speed anyway to not just turn it into, clubbing baby seals. Let your opponent constrain you or close the line on you. Don't just put yourself into an advantageous position where you can't lose. Practice some of the, for instance, the Capoeira Clever Man's counterattacks. Practice the more complex moves, because you're fighting slower anyway, and you have the time to be more deliberate about it. If you're fighting someone who's not a beginner, but you are better than, practice on executing perfectly, addressing your weaknesses, and increasing awareness. So this is where I will practice newer tools that need work. I'll also spare some of my awareness to observe myself and my opponent. So I'll make sure that I'm fully aware of what I'm doing, and I'm fully aware of what they're doing. This is where I'll look for tells in their attacks. I'll look for signs, so I'm really understanding what's going on. I'll work toward full awareness of where all the hands are in the fight. This is something I do, is I want to know, okay, both my hands are here. My dagger is doing this while my sword is doing this. While I'm doing that, oh, hey, their dagger just went high. I could drop into the belly and strike in the belly. And so I'm working toward being aware of where all four hands are in the fight. I can't do that in a fight against an equal or better opponent. I'm just going to get stabbed. But against the weaker opponent, I'm going to be able to focus on that and still give them a good fight, because it's going to be one of the things that's going to slow me down to 80% speed to make it an interesting fight for them. And as I get through that against more and more advanced fighters, I bring that awareness and the ability to track what everything's going on in the fight up to more and more and more of my competitive fights. Against an equal fighter, if you're fighting someone who's about as good as you are, focus on a few specifics and execute them well. This is where you say, I'm working on this tool set now. And if that turns into doing some directed sparring, fine. If you want to ask for a drill, ask for a drill. These people who are at your skill level could be your best drill partners, because they're going to be able to challenge you to execute properly. Once it becomes easy to execute against them, then you need to bring it into a competitive fight instead of a drill. So you're focusing, this is where you really focus on sharpening your particular tool set. After they start acclimating to that, it's just not working anymore because they've seen it enough times and they know what they need to counter it. Step back, ask for 30 seconds to clear your mind, then start into another tool set. Finally, this is one of my main pieces of advice against a fighter who is maybe not against a beginner, but I'll still do it against beginners. I'll always ask to fight the last round of a practice fight as a tourney fight. And my only goal is to win. Against a beginning fighter, I'm not really trying to beat them, but I want them to get in the mindset of saying, hey, this is a competitive fight. We're fighting to one touch. I need to bring my best fight here. Take your time. Don't rush to a kill. You're not fighting a practice fight that needs to last 30 seconds anymore. If it takes 2 to 3 minutes, that's fine. Practice your patience, practice your focus, find the right opening, and then attack it without mercy. Against the better fighter, look to improve your confidence in a difficult fight. There are a lot of people who frequently, when facing me,
will go, oh crap, I drew Todd, and they already know they've lost this fight. This is not something you want to practice. You do not want to practice just going into a fight with no hope, or going, we're going to do practice and he's going to hit me 13 times and I'm going to hit him 3. You want to come into a fight with a focus. So when I fight a better fighter, I look for their weaknesses. I go, hey, maybe I've gotten hit 5 times while I've been looking for their weaknesses in a practice. But I want to figure out which of my tools make them uncomfortable or make them backpedal fast or look like they have the best opportunity. And then I will want to work on exploiting those. I may need to, against a better fighter, disguise my intent somewhat. If I make it real obvious what I'm going to do, they're probably going to adapt before I can even make it work. But you can take that approach. And it's better to practice techniques that give you a chance of winning than it is to play to the opponent's strengths. If you're like, I'm just going to shoot a shot right up the middle against Blade, no, you're probably not. He's probably going to block it. Don't try to beat him on that. Don't try to beat him on that speed. Focus on the things that give you a chance to win instead. Give yourself smaller goals. If you want to fight aggressively, you want to get in someone's grill because you're a shorter fighter and you need to cross the danger zone where you're out of range and you want to stay there and keep fighting. Last 30 seconds while fighting aggressively. Push them back 4 steps. Try to take the sword arm when they get greedy. Look for smaller concrete goals you can accomplish. Essentially, play for accomplishments rather than for wins if you're not going to get the wins. In practice, stop and ask what just happened. Do your rewind slow motion and then learn from it. And again, fight the last round or a few rounds as a tourney fight and use what seemed best. So you've been fighting somebody, you've been being, hey, this seems to work. I think that'll work. That might work. Can't make it quite work, but it seems to be like showing more progress. So that did hit once or twice a couple turns ago. Let me set that up. So now we're in a tourney fight. Now I'm fighting Master So-and-so, and they're better than me. And my goal is to win this last damn fight. So I've just set up as a tourney fight, right? I know what I want to try. I've thought about it already. I need to set it up and give that its best chance to succeed. If Tool X gives me a 25% chance of winning, and that's better than anything else I've got, I'm going to use Tool X. And I'm going to use it with full commitment. And finally, against somebody who's way, way better than you, if you're at practice and somebody from out of the area comes wearing a whole bunch of white accessories, let them teach you. Don't just go, I want to throw down with you. I mean, that's great. Throw down with them. By all means, do a couple of like really competitive fights at the end. But don't be afraid to ask them to slow down to your speed. Like if someone's just repeatedly punking you in the head and it's not fun and it's not useful, ask them to slow down. Ask them if they'll let you constrain them. Ask them to fight single while you're working on Dagger or Case. Chances are they'd happily do that, but they don't want to insult you by doing it. So don't be afraid to ask for it. You can say, hey, I'm working on this thing. Could you help me with that? Could we do a drill? You know. And finally, after you fight someone like that, ask them what you're doing well and what you're doing poorly and follow up on those things. It's also a good way to establish a relationship with a better fighter, which is a good thing. That's all I have. Any questions?
You do have one question in the chat.
Okay.
Let's see. Taking things on a bit of a tangent in regards to tools. Mm-hmm. Which secondary do you feel is the most ideal for a starting combatant in either tourney or melee? Also, other than the initial period where some kingdoms have that require you to authorize in single sword first, would there ever be a practical reason to fight without a secondary?
Okay, so for the first question, in terms of the context of tools, that's the question of what do you think, like, what weapons are best? In the context of tools, daggers often give you a more tool-based system where there are more things you can try. You have most visibility of your opponent. There are going to be more openings. So there are going to be more techniques that are relevant as a technique. My personal preference for teaching first weapons is to teach daggers because they have a very simple system and parry up, parry down, parry left, parry right. And I think it is simpler to teach that in context. It's not necessarily simpler to execute it, but I can teach a very simple dagger system that they can work with and go forward. As far as actually succeeding with it, I find bucklers probably have the lowest barrier to entry to success. And the reason for that is, you know, as I was showing you earlier, if I just hold my arm straight out and aim that at my opponent's hilt, I kind of need to, I do this as a demonstration in practice when I first introduced buckler, and I'll do it without a mask, and which I realize the SCA doesn't really get excited about, but I'll do it without a mask. I'll aim this at their hilt, and I'll ask them to try to hit me. And unless I really screw it up, I don't get hit, even with no weapon in my offhand, because all I'm doing is just completely creating a cone of defense that denies them any access to my body. As long as this stays locked on your hilt, you're not getting anywhere. The only thing you need to know is while you're doing that, if it puts the buckler in front of your face, you need to move your head. Also in melees, I find that bucklers are by far the most useful object to defend with from threats you aren't aware of, as long as you remember to hold it out in front of you. Or even if you don't hold it out in front of you, if you keep it kind of like, you know, half back like this in a melee, which is normally where people will keep it rather than extend it, keeping it half back will still defend against shots coming in from off angles that you're not necessarily watching. So for beginning melee combatants, I will usually give them a buckler. Part of that is just that I can turn out half a dozen bucklers in an afternoon and then everyone has a buckler. But part of that is because it's a good passive weapon that doesn't require a lot of your brain if you don't want to use your brain. Alternatively, when I fight that locked on style, I will point out that I'm very successful with the buckler using that locked on style, and probably 80% of my brain, is focused on that. I think there's a lot of reason to fight with single. I think single is the foundation to basically any style of offhand weapon. You can, I'm not going to say you can't, right? There are two styles of sword and dagger, which I think everybody's seen too many times, which really don't require the use of the sword for anything other than stabbing the guy, right? One of them is Black Tiger, where my dagger is up here, and all I do is cross parry nearly everything. And my sword is on my hip. Way back there. Stand up. Stand on my tiptoes. You can see it down here. The goal of having a low guard is to keep your sword free. When you take a low guard, by keeping your sword free, you're essentially, you're putting it out of your opponent's reach, and you're keeping it so that you can just use it for offense. But that puts you completely dependent on your offhand weapon. Now, if I need to get somebody ready to fight a duel in 30 days, I would probably teach Black Tiger, because there's a high probability that if I stand like this, my opponent is dumb enough to attack my chest, right? But I would teach that as a beginning session, because someone coming to me who's going to fight a duel in 30 days and has never fought before is an idiot. And if I can't talk them out of it, I might as well give them the best chance of success. The reason you want to bring the sword into presence is the sword has a huge ability to constrain your opponent's options, right? So, for instance, if I'm fighting, sword and dagger, if I put this sword here, I create the dilemma for the opponent where they don't know what I'm going to parry with, and I've protected on both sides, right? And if they choose to attack with power, they put their whole body behind it, this dagger can push their sword anywhere I want, no matter what their form was. And if they choose to attack with speed, the sword will have leverage over anything they do. And there's no way they can know in advance other than by probing and seeing what my tendencies are to do that. Similarly, I've had a number of people lately who wanted to jump into case. I've had a lot of people who want to fight case. And they want to fight case, machine gun style. They want to attack. I want to attack here, I'm going to attack there, I'm going to attack here, I'm going to attack there, attack here, attack there, attack here, attack there. I'm just driving my opponent batty, right? And the problem with that is your opponent has two swords too. And if you mess any of that up, what you get is a messy double kill, right? But instead, if I have practiced my single sword, then even if my opponent has two swords, right? If I am fighting here and my opponent attacks here, I can attack like this, possibly with a compass, right? Close the line against both their swords and stab them in the meantime, right? And that's the foundation on which I want to build an offhand weapon style, is that I could just do everything with a sword. But now instead of one sword, I have two, right? So now, as I go to close the line and compass, this sword drops low and closes the line off. If they then make a panic parry and beat this sword out of the way, This sword comes up and stabs them in the chest, right? Is that better? Sure, it's better, right? But it doesn't work without the foundation of being able to close the line effectively with the sword and use the strong of my sword as a shield while I'm using the point as the weapon. I think that's all.